Okay, there we go. Well, good evening again. I'm still Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine. And first off, I'd like to thank the staff here at Six and I for helping to make this evening possible. You know, we at Politics and Prose absolutely love this place for author events because, as you can see, it's just so wonderfully spacious and elegant. We'd also like to thank all of you for supporting both Six and I and P&P in our continuing efforts to bring readers and authors together. And what an impactful event we have for you this evening. Whether you've ever lost someone or know someone who has or worry about losing someone, basically that covers just about all of us. Geraldine Brooks's new book, Memorial Days, will be meaningful for you. It captures in spare yet very moving language what grieving over a loss is like and offers important lessons in how to get through such difficult times. Geraldine is one of those writers, of course, who's proven herself skilled at both nonfiction and fiction. She started as a journalist, reporting first for the Sydney Morning Herald in Australia, her home country, and then attended journalism school at Columbia University where she met Tony Horwitz. They married in 1984 and together ended up reporting for the Wall Street Journal in the Middle East, Africa, and the Balkans. Geraldine also wrote a couple of works of nonfiction in the 1990s, including 9 Parts of Desire and Foreign Correspondents. By the 2000s, after starting a family with Tony, Geraldine had switched to writing fiction. Her first novel, Year of Wonders, became an international bestseller. Her next, March, won the Pulitzer for Fiction in 2006. And subsequent books, People of the Book, Caleb's Crossing, and The Secret Chord, also were bestsellers and very well received by critics. Tony had won a Pulitzer as well in 1995 for national reporting on grim working conditions in low-wage jobs. And he authored a number of nonfiction books, among them the bestsellers Confederates in the Attic and Blue Latitudes. In May 2019, he was on tour here in Washington for another book, Spying on the South, when he collapsed from cardiac arrest and died. Just 60 years old, he'd been a vibrant, sociable, funny, warm-hearted person, often the life of the party. Several years later, after completing her 6th novel, Horse, Geraldine went to a tiny island off the southeastern coast of Australia to write Memorial Days. In chapters that alternate between descriptions of her solitude on the island and flashbacks to the trauma of losing Tony, she recalls the wonderful life she had shared with her husband and her pained efforts to move on without him. This book will truly touch you. In conversation with Geraldine will be Kara Swisher, who for years has been a leading chronicler of the tech world and a popular commentator. And she and Geraldine are longtime friends since their days together at the Wall Street Journal. Currently, Kara hosts the twice-a-week podcast On with Kara Swisher and co-hosts another great podcast, Pivot. She's also a regular panelist on CNN and author of Burn Book, which is a lively, informative history and accounting of the tech industry's most powerful players. It came out last year. It's about to come out in a couple of weeks in paperback with a new afterword about Elon Musk. Please join me in welcoming Geraldine Brooks and Kara Swisher.
Thanks. Oh. We're not going to talk about Elon Musk,
Yes.
if you don't mind. I think we've heard just about enough from Mr. Musk to last us a lifetime. He should go to Mars like he wants, like tomorrow. Anyway, it'd be great. Godspeed.
He's such a moving target.
Really?
Must be hard to finish the afterward.
Yes, it is. The book is a lot about him, too.
Abuse him about a new thing every day.
It's true. Just don't say I didn't warn you all. Okay, so I want to talk about your book, actually. I'm very excited to talk about it. We're going to put this on with Kara Swisher. It's going to be an episode next Monday, so we're very excited. So we're glad that you're here. So be enthusiastic to show your love for Geraldine, which I have great love. I am actually, in the end, going to ask you about your project with Michael Lewis called Who is Government? The Untold Story of Public Service, because it's so in the news. But we'll get to that in a minute. But I'm so honored to be here with you tonight to talk about your memoir, Memorial Days, and also Tony, who I knew very well. I don't remember where I first met him, but he was a wonderful, spirited, astonishing reporter, and just the loveliest of people. And I have a memory of bringing my son, after I had a baby, out to your beautiful house in, what's the...
Waterford.
Yes, exactly. And we sat, it was a hot, hot day, and you guys were having an astonishing party, and I sat and breastfed and talked to him right outside there in this beautiful place. And you had already had kids and give me all kinds of advice, and I just have so many great memories of him. I didn't know you at the Wall Street Journal, though. When you were Hobro, I didn't know when you were Hobro. That was the name. Can you explain that? Explain Hobro to get to start, because it's not the bros you're thinking about, not the bad ones.
So we reported together in the Middle East. When I say together, it often wasn't literally together, but we reported from opposite sides of the various conflicts. So if I was in Tunisia waiting for Arafat to talk to me at 2 o'clock in the morning, Tony would be in Israel chatting up Rabin, and then we'd put the two together. And likewise, Iran and Iraq, or Iraq and Saudi Arabia, we would cover the conflicts from opposite sides. Sometimes we reported together, but we often had a joint byline, Geraldine Brooks and Tony Horwitz, or the other way around. And in news meetings, they just started referring to us as Hobro. And what's Hobro filing today? And we liked that because we felt like we were more than partners. We felt like we were almost one person.
Right, but you met in, can I just pull this around? Are you guys getting a lot of popping? So move it closer, I think, probably.
Further away.
Maybe so. It's a bit of popping.
Is that better?
All right, go ahead.
Okay.
Say something.
I'll try and keep my head.
No, that's really
still.
popping a lot.
Really
Yeah.
popping.
Yeah, I think mine is
Oh,
because
thank you.
mine is beautifully attached to my face, as if I am Billie Eilish right here. Okay.
Okay, is that better? No.
Oh,
Yes? Yes? We'll see. We'll see.
let's
how we-
turn off hers. That one. Go ahead. Okay. So but you met at journalism school. Explain where you went.
We did.
and-
So I had been working as a newspaper reporter in Sydney for a couple of years, and then I was lucky enough to get a scholarship to do a master's at Columbia.
I'm also an alumni. I also went there.
Yes.
Yes.
And this is, Australians love to, go overseas and have an adventure abroad. So this was going to be my adventure abroad. I was going to have a year in New York and hone my journalistic skills and then get back to Sydney and get on with my real life. That was the plan. But the first week of school, I went to a party on the Upper West Side, and on the balcony was this cute blonde guy who was telling an amusing story about he was living down in Alphabet City, which in those days was a rough part of New York. It hadn't gentrified up yet.
Yes. Now you can get 12 kinds of kombucha, but go ahead.
Yeah, so he had learned that he couldn't figure out why his car battery was always being stolen, and then he realized that it was a scam and he could buy it back from the local auto parts dealer every day. So he realized that you have to take not only the key of your car, but also the battery when you left your car. So I thought that was quite amusing. And then the next day, there was the large group seminar in the World Room, and I saw him across the hall, and I waved to him, and he didn't wave back. And I thought, you and the horse you rode in on. And I didn't think about him again for 6 months until we found ourselves in a seminar on business reporting that we had both taken on a whim because we thought if you're going to be a journalist who smashes capitalism, you should understand something about how it works. So we'd both been drawn to it, and once we were in class together, I was really impressed with his idealism. He'd come to journalism school from organizing poor black woodcutters in Mississippi, trying to get them fair pay for their pulpwood hauling. And as I got to know him, I realized that he told me that he hadn't waved back to me in the World Room because the night before he'd been out carousing with his brother at Danceteria and dropped his glasses down the toilet, so he couldn't even see me.
Kismet.
And I said, yeah, but, after that, you saw me. And he said, yeah, but you were always sitting next to that guy called Bronstein, who was a very handsome, charming guy. And I said, we were seated alphabetically.
So what got you together? It just was spending time?
Well, it was partly his incredible insight and idealism in this class, and partly his beautifully tanned, sculpted forearms.
Any other part?
Well, that was the initial attraction. He was always borrowing money from me as well.
Okay. All right. Sounds perfect. So
I had to keep track of him.
So, and then you were together since then and worked together as reporters. So
we got together very quickly. It was inconvenient because it was almost the end of the year, and I'd already accepted a job with the Wall Street Journal. So
in Cleveland.
So yeah, the recruiter had come and they were interviewing me, and my professor said, now, when you go to your interview, they're going to ask you the Cleveland question, which is, would you take this job if it meant relocating to Cleveland? Don't worry. It's just a test. They want to see how serious you are about working for the Wall Street Journal. So I went, they asked, I answered, and they sent me there.
Procter & Gamble, right?
And he was, he had an internship on the West Coast, but he came to see me on the way west, and we had a fantastic weekend together. And lucky for me, the radio in his car conked out just as he was leaving the city limits, so he had the whole drive to Eugene, Oregon, to think about what a great weekend we'd had. And he turned around, came back, and got a job in Fort Wayne.
So from there on, you worked together. So the memoir itself oscillates between two narrative threads, essentially. The first begins on May 27th, 2019, when a phone call when you learned Tony had died. The second, recently, in 2003, early 2003, as you on your way to stay on this Flinders Island in Tasmania. I'm going to ask you why you chose that island. And the third is omnipresent Tony himself. I want you to talk about these three elements that seem to be in the book: processing death, allowing grief, and commemorating love, and also telling his story.
Yeah, I didn't think about this time on the island as writing a book. I just needed to take some time to think about what had happened, because it had been 3 years and I wasn't right in the head. I realized that I had, after the first crazy year of just panic and drama and dealing with the horrible, crushing tasks of figuring out how your life works when the person who looked after half of it is not there. Then the second year, just trying to crawl back to my desk and do some work, thinking that work might be therapeutic, and trying to look after my sons, and just realized at the 3-year mark, really, that I had been acting this role the whole time of a woman being normal. That was the part that I was playing. And it was just exhausting because I didn't really feel normal at all. It was a mask I put on when I went out to be the secretary of the PTO or sit on the Conservation Commission or whatever it was I was doing.
Why did you choose that role?
I was trying to be that person, but I wasn't getting there. And I realized it was time to do something about that. And then it was kind of this head-slapping moment, like, you're a writer. This is the most important thing that's ever happened in your life. Why don't you do what you do and write about it? But I wasn't thinking about, the form of the book or how I was going to tell the story. I just needed to get away from my real life and that whole pretense of normalcy and be completely abnormal alone for a while.
And why did you pick this place? Besides the fantastic name, Flanders Island, Tasmania.
Flinders Island is in the Bass Strait, which is the waterway between the mainland of Australia and the state of Tasmania. And it was a place that I loved. Tony and I had gone there together when I was thinking about my second novel, and I was planning to write about a really interesting character from Australian history, but for various reasons, that book didn't work out. But we had this trip there, and it was absolutely our kind of place. It's just beautiful, natural forests and marshes and beaches and mountains and hardly any people. It's sort of, we ended up on Martha's Vineyard, and this place is like Martha's Vineyard. If somebody looked at Martha's Vineyard and said, all those beaches and woods and rolling fields are very nice, but it needs a couple of Transylvanian mountains to give it some drama. Mm-hmm. So, and then there's only 900 people live there year round. So
it was a good place to get away. Now, one of the things I want you to talk about dealing with the death, because you just mentioned it. There's a call and then all the bureaucracy. I did love that you wrote about the bureaucracy, and you have a really terrible experience with the hospital itself here in D.C. Can you talk about the bureaucracy part of it?
I just think we don't deal with this very well. Popular culture leads you to have an expectation about what would happen if something, and I've since learned that I'm not alone here. A lot of people get this news in a phone call. But it was unimaginable to me that you would just pick up the phone on any given day and somebody 500 miles away would just flatly tell you that your life as you knew it was over without even asking you, are you alone? Are you okay? Do you need to call, no. It was a very brief conversation with a very tired young doctor who obviously was at the end of her long, hard working day on a holiday weekend. I don't blame her, I blame the process that threw that job at her. Mm-hmm. It would be so easy to have a protocol in place where you call the local police who are used to dealing with this kind of bereavement and sudden, who would, and in our little town, I know all those guys because they coach the kids, the cross teams and whatnot, and they would have known who to call to be there to support me, and it would take like 10 extra minutes to do that. I don't understand why nobody thinks that way.
And the rest of it became also complex. Your son found out a different way.
Well, my kids were not at home, and one of them was on a plane. I'd spoken to him that morning. He'd just graduated from college, and he was having a big trip overseas with his girlfriend, and he was about to get on a plane in Manila to fly to Sydney to see my sister. And then I got the news, and by the time I called him back, he was already in flight. And so I didn't get to break the news to him because when he arrived in Sydney, he turned on his phone and he saw 2 missed calls from me and then a text saying, I really loved your dad, past tense. So that's how he found out.
Mm-hmm. So when you talk about the bureaucracy, there was a lot of it attached to it, of moving it. You talk about the inability to die with dignity, I guess, or the people who are left. Why did that stick with you? Why was that important for you to write about here?
Sorry,
when you talk about the process of death in this book quite a bit, what struck you in the entire process? It just seemed every bit of it was terrible for you in that. Not the death itself, obviously.
Again, it's this picture you have built up in your mind, like somebody comes to the door, they say, are you sitting down? Is there someone can I get you a cup of tea? And then you go, if you have to identify the body of your beloved, you actually go into the morgue and, there's a morgue attendant and none of that. I went to the morgue and I wasn't allowed to see his body. I had to identify him from a photograph. And it's just, there's an inhumanity to it that I think is very unnecessary. And I don't understand how we've let ourselves get so removed from the basic business of empathy. Mm-hmm. But then I shouldn't be surprised because there seems to be a massive empathy deficit if you look at what's going on right now in our government.
So in chapter titled May 31st, 2019, 4 days later, you give a nod to W.H. Auden's Funeral Blues. Can you read this section? And then I have a question.
I don't think I can unless
no.
it's got any reading.
Oh, okay. You want me to do it?
I think I can.
Okay.
All the clocks do not stop. No one silences the phone. The dogs continue to bark, the pianos to play. Old poet Whiston could not command the world to acknowledge his great loss, neither can I. As much as I yearned to throw a black veil over my head and sit weeping under a yew tree, that was not possible. Modern life is a juggling act, and if you don't keep those flaming torches moving swiftly through the air, if you lose your focus and drop one, the whole stage might catch fire and collapse beneath you.
So talk a little bit about that, the compartmentalization. Obviously, you're referencing the poem itself, but you had juggled a lot, a career in journalism, book writing, kids. You having to function through Tony's death sounds excruciating. It reads as excruciating. Can you talk about that? And what do you wish you had known something before this happened, to have thought about it in any way?
I wish I knew why he had puts on the Nikkei Stock Exchange. I mean, just, if you're married to somebody for 35 years, you fall into a division of labor. And we had fallen into the division of labor where, he did the things he was good at and I did the things I was good at. And it turned out that I did the things that you could see and he did the things you couldn't see. Mm-hmm. I looked after the food in the garden, and if something, if the toilet cistern broke, I got out the spanner and did that. That was my stuff. And he looked after our retirement accounts and investments and insurance and taxes. And I hadn't had to think about it for 35 years. Mm-hmm. And I didn't have a clue how that side of our life worked. Mm-hmm. I didn't even know where those accounts were or what the passwords were for them. And I certainly had never paid attention to why he made the decisions that he did. But he enjoyed that. That was something that he'd grown up with. His grandfather, who was a lawyer in New Haven, thought a good outing for a visiting 5-year-old grandson was to go and watch the ticker at Merrill Lynch. So, his grandfather loved investing and taught him all about solid blue chips, but also speculations. His grandfather loved to speculate on the price of October eggs. Mm-hmm. And so Tony grew up.
They're very expensive right now.
Yes. It would be good to be long on those, I guess. Yeah.
So talk about the idea of compartmentalization, too, because you had to sort of compartmentalize everything that you did.
Well, it's just things that I had never thought about, like the fact that he was the primary on all the credit cards. So the minute his death certificate is filed, his Social Security number triggers a cascade of events, including the cancellation of all my credit cards. Mm-hmm. Unbeknownst to me, for a month, it also triggered the cancellation of our health insurance. So my 2 kids and I were walking around in this crazy country uninsured for a month. Even though I'd paid the premium, it hadn't actually bought us anything.
In the book, you also reflect on how various religions and cultures do allow for stop clocks. You didn't get a stop clock in those years.
Yeah, if we were Orthodox Jews, there would have been a very set formula that we would have followed. And it's interesting when you read about these other, ways of dealing with grief. The Jewish way, one of the things that struck me is that the first period after a loss is annuit, which is where the bereaved, you don't even offer consolation because the person is in no state to be consoled. So you just go around them quietly doing the necessary things. And then you move into Shiva, which is the active grieving. And the idea that it takes you about 24 to 48 hours to be ready to actively grieve because the state of shock is so great. Mm-hmm. And I didn't get that because I'm on Martha's Vineyard on Memorial Day and Tony's died in Washington, and my first instinct is I have to get there. So I'm calling the airport, and then I'm rushing to the boat, and I'm getting on in Ubers, and, and that's kind of a crazy way to deal with
shock that happens. It's the sorry business in Australian Aboriginal culture.
That's amazing. So Aboriginal grieving. So in Judaism, it's a very narrow band of people who have grief responsibilities. And for most people, the period of grieving is very finite. In Aboriginal culture, it's the whole community. Everybody has a notional relationship to everybody else in any given Aboriginal community. And so everybody is involved in this loss, and Aboriginal people travel vast distances to get back for what's called sorry business. And it can go on for weeks until everybody has come back. And every time a new person arrives, the grief starts up again in the same intensity.
So if you could borrow from the cultures you were looking at, what would have been your ritual if you had?
So my ritual was what I ended up doing 3 years late, which was to just go into nature and get sustenance from that, because that is something that I find very sustaining. And in the quiet of being taken out of the responsibilities of my ordinary life, even the loved responsibilities of walking the dog or feeding the horses, I didn't have anything between me and thinking about Tony. And that was what I needed to do, as it turns out.
Do you have a notion why mourning is so difficult? Is it because the culture is coming at you at one time? Because I can occupy myself all day long doing things. But talk about, why do you think we've lost our ability to mourn?
I am not sure. Maybe because I think in Western societies we're pretty lucky in that, particularly in affluent parts of Western societies, we don't see a lot of untimely death. Mm-hmm. And so it's usually, people die when we expect them to, and you grieve them, but often it happens in a sanitized hospital situation. It's not at home like it used to be. And also our lives are just so overwhelmingly busy. People can't drop everything the way in more traditional cultures people do drop everything. Mm-hmm. And, I realize I'm in an immense place of privilege here, because for a lot of people, their whole life, their material life changes with a sudden death like this. And also, to have somebody who was beloved and recognized for what he did and had such a full life, and then to have the luxury of being able to take myself off and be alone. And, I understand that if you're working 2 jobs to keep food on the table for your kids, you're not going to be able to do that. Mm-hmm.
So there's a passage in the book, I feel like a synthesis of your experience. Would you mind reading it?
I certainly hadn't been afraid to be by myself, but I hadn't realized how much I would embrace it. Now it is beginning to feel like an addiction. I'm craving the absolute serenity of an unpeopled landscape. And then I understand that I have not been alone. I'm reveling in this time because I'm with Tony. In this solitude, finally, I can think about him undistracted. I can read his journals and commune with his thoughts. I can even do what I believed his death had denied me, learn new things about him. There are no kids, no animals, no editors, publicists, neighbors, or friends. No one, no matter how beloved, is barging in on us here. I can be beside him all my conscious day, and even beyond, into my unconscious nights. Solitude has made this space for him.
That's wonderful. When you talk about the culture of grieving, it seems like people think grief is only wallowing in sadness. There's nothing sad about that passage. You write, our culture is averse to sad, and one of the things you also write, I merely wished for the bereaved some space and time and space, however long, however short, for melancholy, what Victor Hugo described as the happiness of being sad. Talk about the aversity to being sad, melancholy maybe, but also joyful, reverent.
I think, this was something I noticed when I was covering the siege of Sarajevo. Mm-hmm. I think optimistic Americans tend to think, we've got our seat belts and we've got our FDA-approved foods. We might not have them for much longer. Mm-hmm. But there's this idea that you can make yourself safe, and it's almost an effrontery if something goes wrong with that. Like, what went wrong? You want to blame somebody for it, and I fell into this trope as well, like, this should not have happened. Well, for a lot of the world, it happens all the time, but we're so removed from it. And then I think when people are distraught, we're very uncomfortable about it. We're looking at the watch like, it's been a year, why aren't you cheered up? We want you to be happy.
Move along.
Let's see if we can make you happy, mm-hmm. Instead of just letting people take whatever it is they need to do.
What did you do when people said, let's see if we can make you happy?
I let them try. That was the whole performance part of it.
Right, the woman being normal.
Yeah.
The memoir is about you, and it's about Tony. His life before you, your life together. You read his journals, some of which surprised you. So someone we both know sent in a question for you, and I'd like to play it. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Martha Sherrill. Kara, you probably don't realize this, but Bill Powers, my husband, and I met at your apartment at a New Year's Eve party in D.C., and we were married on Tony and Geraldine's back porch about 6 years later. I have a question for Geraldine. Tony was just the most alive, vibrant person, and I've always wondered if he was like that most of the time, and if that's what you fell in love with when you fell in love with him, the way we all did. Thanks.
Yes.
Well, you're welcome, Martha Sherrill, from both of us being married. Go ahead.
Yeah, he was. And that was a great boon to me because I was quite introverted and he was very extroverted, and I could sort of, follow in his bright wake while he did all the hard work of our friendships. Mm-hmm. And I just enjoyed, the cruise. And he was mostly like that, although, when I was reading his journals, I realized that came hard won sometimes, that he had a lot of insecurities, and a lot of them were totally unfounded. I mean, I found this one line in the journal. I was off reporting somewhere, and this was before he'd been hired by the Wall Street Journal, and he was still waiting for this staff job to eventuate that he'd been kind of promised, and it hadn't happened. And so he writes in his journal, I've come to accept that I may never amount to something in journalism. And I read that and I just laughed out loud because 1 year later he would be the star reporter in the London bureau of the Wall Street Journal covering the revolution in Romania, and then leading the coverage of the first Gulf War and being the first Western reporter into liberated Kuwait, and then he'd have the Pulitzer Prize the year after that. So it was funny to me that he thought that, and then it was also sad that he'd been insecure at that time, and he had not verbalized that.
Did you, when Martha's talking about the most alive, vibrant person. I don't recall a time when he wasn't smiling, even when he was talking about tough things. I think we were talking about one of the battles, and he was talking about the racism that went on when he was covering it and how he dealt with it. And I'm like, oh, I'd hit him. He's like, no, it was really interesting talking to him. I was like, okay, great. Sounds fantastic. What do you think drove that in him? What was the part that got him like that?
You know, he had a high moral purpose. He was a reporter of great seriousness, but he loved people, and he loved trying to find out what made people the way they were and what made them think the way they did. And he ran towards the people that other people back away from. And I have to say, when I watched the invasion of the Capitol on January 6th, I looked at those guys and with their Confederate flags and their stringy hair and, you know, the strangeness of it, and I thought, Tony's probably had a beer with at least 10 to 20% of those guys, because he really wanted to know why people embraced that ideology and what it meant for this society. And I think he was very prescient in seeing the fault lines forming way before other people noticed the divisions, income inequality, the divisions between urban and rural, north and south, the whole 9 yards of the things that we have seen pulling us further and further apart.
Now, I have this passage here where you talked about this. The Great American Divide, north-south, urban-rural, rich-poor, had been his subject. It was a story he was made to cover, and it made me sad he couldn't. He was touring on a book called Spying of the South when he died, a product which he called a pub crawl across the old Confederacy, conducting barstool democracy. It was a follow-up to the bestseller Confederates in the Attic. Talk about that, because he was very early. He's one of the first people I heard talking about this anger that was building within people.
Yeah, no, when he wrote Confederates in the Attic, I think he was reporting that in 96.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not very good at dates, but I think it was 96 when he was on the road reporting that, and he would come back, you know, with these incredible stories of the people that he'd encountered for whom the Civil War was not finished. Mm-hmm. And then Spying on the South was a kind of brilliant conceit. It was based on the fact that Frederick Law Olmsted, before he became the founder of landscape architecture and the creator of Central Park and Prospect Park and all the other great landscapes that he created, was a reporter for the New York Times. And he went south with an assignment to look at why the country was so divided right before the Civil War, and was there anything that could be done about it. So Tony decided to take Olmsted's journals and reporting from that time and redo the trip and ask the same question. And it turned out to be a brilliant book.
So I highly recommend you going back and reading them, because they were so prescient. He was a historian, a traveler, and he tried to really walk a mile in other people's shoes. In one of the first scenes in Confederate in the Attic, spoon under a thin blanket for the night. He also, when he was reporting for the Wall Street Journal about the unlivable working conditions, and he talked about the economy that was a huge factor in getting President Trump elected. What do you think he would have made of the political situation we're in now? He obviously documented this divisiveness, but would have been surprised?
I think we really missed out on the fact that he wasn't around to keep doing what he had. You know, it was essentially his life's work of seeing how these historical rifts were playing out in contemporary society. And I think, you know, he would have probably embedded with those guys and followed their court cases, and I don't know, but I think, you know, that was the story that he'd really devoted himself to.
What did he think of it at the time? Was he worried?
At the time, he was extremely worried. He was extremely worried that we were losing the ability to talk to each other, mm-hmm. and that we couldn't, that there wasn't a shared community of facts that we all agreed on. I think that was troubling to him, but it's only just got so much worse in the 5 years since he died. I don't know he would make of it now.
So one of the books, I want to go back to the journals, and you wrote you were inclined to believe he would prefer his papers to leave here uncensored, but you wanted some private time with his thoughts before you shipped them away, which you did. You said, I want whatever they might reveal is what you said. Were you worried before the start of reading them that whatever could be? Did you hesitate?
Did I hesitate? No. Our relationship was, it was solid and built on great trust. So I didn't think that there was going to be anything that I would learn that would rattle me. Mm-hmm. And
except the surprise of possible despondency. And you write,
Yeah.
These journals in general are not happy reading. My sunny, funny lover is rarely found in these passages. I began to see that he turned to his journals when he was not that guy that didn't need them. What you wanted to meet him again in some way that you didn't know him, correct, through reading through them?
Yeah, and I should add that he stopped journaling once he started writing the books, because then he was really content in his work. Mm-hmm. I think he realized that he didn't like working for editors. And
Nobody does.
Lots of us don't particularly like it, but he really didn't like it.
I married one, but go ahead.
I think, so when he had control over his product in the way that you do when it's a book, I mean, he was a bit of a control freak in that regard. And once he had that, and the astonishing good luck that we had to both be able to make a living writing books, which is, by no means a given, that worked out for us. He became a very contented man, and blow me down, there are no journals.
Mm-hmm. Later. Talk about the margin notes, though.
The margin notes, okay, yeah.
Love a margin note.
We disagreed on very few things, but one of them was how you treat your books. I would no sooner write in pen on a book than get a knife out and just gouge this piece of furniture. I get a book and I take the dust jacket off it while I read it. And I, clean hands, don't read it while I'm eating. I want my books to, last. And he was the opposite. He turned down pages, he scribbled all over them in pen, and I thought that was just terrible. But now I'm really glad, because if I pick up a book that he had read and I haven't read it yet, it's like I'm reading along with him, and I can learn what he thought of it.
And what's the funniest thing he wrote, honestly?
Okay, so with me to Flinders Island, I finally took a few of the books that kind people had gifted me about grief and loss, and then I pulled off the shelf this tattered galley of Year of Magical Thinking, and we had a tattered galley of Joan Didion's book, because Tony had been judging the National Book Award that year, and so he got an early galley, and of course it was really messed up, like most of his books were. And I'm on Flinders Island, and I start reading this heartbreaking account of how she lost John Gregory Dunn so suddenly, and Tony has scrawled, name-dropping, padded. And Didion won the National Book Award, but no thanks to Judge Tony, apparently.
Well, speaking of Joan Didion, he was correct, by the way. Sorry, I love Joan Didion, but I would agree with him on that one. Speaking of Joan Didion and Joyce Carol Oates, did you think about how the book would fit into the, a grief memoir genre?
I didn't. I was writing this for me, and I wrote it because I needed to write it, and I'm still surprised that anybody needs to read it, but it's only been out a couple of weeks, and I'm just getting a deluge of incoming from people who are reading it and who are relating to it, because, it's another head-slapping moment. We're all going to lose everyone we love. That's the human condition. And people have been incredibly warm in their response to it. So it turns out that I wasn't just writing it for me, but that was what I was thinking of it.
You weren't thinking of it as sort of a genre. I'm going to write about my husband now. Yeah. I know that Michael Lewis, who you worked with, he lost his daughter and has not
My goddaughter, actually, as well. Yeah, his radiant 19-year-old, wonderful daughter.
So when you're in this process of reading journals and private papers to get close to a character, you've done this in your fiction writing for many years. Many of your novels have real historic characters. You noted one before, like March, a fictional character based on a fictional character that was based on a real person. Did you ever start thinking him like a character in one of your books? And talk a little bit about this process for you of reading people's journals to create characters.
Oh, you mean for the fiction?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you're always looking for the voice. You're looking for the voice. I like to write with a first-person narrator in the fiction because I think it gives an immediacy to it. And so I can't really start until I can hear that voice. So to hear voices from the past, you try and read everything that was written by people of that time and place. And that's so much easier with men, because they had the luxury of writing about their lives. They'd had time to write their journals and their extensive correspondences with each other. And the poor women, if they were literate at all, were, working their tail off. And there are no women's journals in America before about 1700 and something. So if you're looking for them in 1665, you are dead out of luck. You're not going to find a woman's journal in this country. Also, enslaved people were not allowed to become literate for the most part. It was against the law to teach enslaved people to read and write. So if you want to find their voices, you end up having to go to court. That's where you find women. That's where you find the enslaved, because their testimony was often taken verbatim. You can hear them speaking in their own voice. You noted, you wrote in the book about Tony, we had no deathbed conversation. I will never know what wisdom Tony would have wanted to impart if he'd been given the chance. Talk about that. Well, so my sons and I have talked about this a lot, and it's very sad for us that we didn't get to say goodbye, but I think maybe for Tony it was better, because he was a guy who was very averse to talking about death. He would never, if I wanted to raise the subject, I watched my mother go downhill with Alzheimer's, which is this just cruel theft of her personality, and I'm really into advanced directives and specifying the kinds of interventions I don't want. I could never get Tony to engage on this, and our oldest son tried to give him Atul Gawande's book, Being Mortal. It's the one book that my son gave him that he refused to read. He just did not want to think about his mortality at all, and as it turned out, he didn't have to.
Right. Did you think about what he might have wanted to impart? Imagine it for yourself?
Oh, yeah. Well, in dreams, that happens all the time. He comes back in dreams, and we have lots of conversations, but I don't know whether my subconscious and his actual intentions are aligned or not, and I never
What's
will.
the last dream you had?
Oh, the last dream I had was because I was really worried about talking about this book in public.
You were?
Yes.
You wanted only to talk to people who knew Tony.
What?
You wanted to only talk to people.
Thank you for being here. Yeah. Well, I didn't want it to be a dirge. I wanted it to be somebody who knew Tony, who would bring his light and humor into the conversation. So, but I was very nervous, right before the first event. So I had this dream in which we had a terrible fight. And we had hardly any fights in real life, but I've had a lot of dreams where I'm fighting with him. And of course, it's not with him, it's with the fact that he's dead.
Why didn't you have any fights? How did you do that?
But we agreed on most things apart from the books and the fact that
in Australia.
And Australia, he didn't want to live in Australia, so he won that argument. And now I've got these two inconvenient American children. Mm-hmm. Very careless of me.
So I want to do a few things, then we'll get questions from the audience, which I have right here. I'm going to read them. You reported on conflicts in Bosnia, Somalia. You were jailed in Nigeria, so you've been up close to what happens when a government breaks down, when the rule of law disappears. Apropos of nothing, big picture, what's your take on what's happening now? I've been talking to people on whether we're on the brink of, or already in the middle of a constitutional crisis. People have differing opinions, but we're talking about it. It's a topic of discussion. I don't think it's media hysteria in any way. Talk a little bit about how you see our current moment.
I realized, okay, so I was in Oxford and I did an absentee ballot, and I had that ballot on my lap. I'm sitting in this medieval cloister filling in my bubbles, and I fill in, of course, Kamala Harris. And I looked at the next bubble and I thought, nobody is going to fill in the bubble for that flaming asshole. And now I realize I don't understand anything about this country because more than half of the electorate chose him after all we know about him. And now we're reaping that harvest. And my instinct is to not be on the streets, not be loudly resisting, just let people see what they voted for. But at what cost, you know? I mean...
And how does it compare to things you covered? Those are obvious, some of them are war complex.
But this is the United States of America. It's not Somalia. You know, you don't expect this place to be run by an unelected billionaire with his snout in every trough, and that's your subject, who anticipated Elon Musk would be running our government. And how is that okay?
And you're
baffled of West Tisbury.
That's your new name. Is that your new profile online? Baffled of West Tisbury. So you are, though, in the midst of a timely project, a book with Michael Lewis and other journalists that's coming out in March about civil servants working in the U.S. government. It's called Who is Government? The Untold Story of Public Service. Can you talk a little bit about this project and why it's important in a time of, I'm going to call it doggy. Sorry. I'm not calling it doge. It's too elegant a word.
It's not fair to doggies.
I think bad doggy works. That doggy's going to bite everyone's ass, etc. So why is it important this time of doggy, bad doggy?
It was, so...
Down doggy.
We started this project in the hopes that this would not occur, and the expectation that it would not occur, because we didn't understand this country very well. Mm-hmm. But all the attacks on government, like public servants are lazy and wasteful and they're not doing anything worthwhile. And this is so fundamentally not true. And Michael Lewis had already written one book about this called The Fifth Risk, in which he basically, during the early days of the first Trump debacle, realized that the beautiful transition that Obama's team had planned for, where every government department had prepared briefing papers for the incoming new administration explaining how everything worked, nobody had turned up from the Trump team to take those briefings. So Michael turned up and got the briefings and said he found this opportunity of all these great stories of the things that government was doing, these problems that they were working on that only this country could possibly have the ambition and the resources to solve. And so he wrote about several of the key people in The Fifth Risk, and then he wanted to revisit that. So he assembled a bunch of his writer friends that he knew and basically set us loose to find somebody in the bureaucracy who was solving a big problem. And he wrote a beautiful piece about the guy who had figured out how to stop coal mine roofs collapsing and saved thousands of lives all over the world because he dedicated his working life to the physics of why coal mine roofs collapse and how to stop that. And I thought, okay, if you're going to defend government, let's defend the most unpopular branch. So I looked for somebody in the IRS. And I found Jared Koopman, who is involved in the cybercrime unit. And his team had liberated 23 kids who were being sexually abused by pedophiles. He put about 173 of those pedophiles behind bars. He cracked down on fentanyl dealers. He figured out how to hijack the websites of Al-Qaeda and Hamas, and so anytime people were contributing cryptocurrency to fund terrorism, it was actually going to the United States Treasury for the Victims of Terror Fund. And while they had the website, they decided to have a bit of fun with it. So if you clicked on the emblem for Hamas, you got rickrolled, which I thought was... And so they did that for about a month while the indictments were being prepared to shut down the people who were laundering the crypto for the terrorists.
Critically important jobs.
Great, and returned billions of dollars to the U.S. Treasury.
So do you think this idea of the pushing every day, we're putting it in the wood chipper, it's fraud and waste everywhere. Just today there was a story, I think it was in the Times, where they said they saved $8 billion, but it really was $8 million.
As you said, math is hard.
Math is hard, is what I said. These are not the smartest people. I know you think they are, but they're not. Trust me. But do you think that's going to stick? Why do you think it's resonant in working on that?
I'm not sure if that half of the electorate is even hearing about this. Mm-hmm. You know, I do occasionally change the channel and listen to what they're presenting, and they are still putting up these total lies about what USAID was doing. This has been proven to be false. Mm-hmm. Several of these cases that they make a big deal of, funding, trans plays in Ireland or whatever it is, it didn't happen, but half of the electorate who's watching that doesn't know. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how we fix that.
So getting these stories out is important.
Yes, but are they being received? Because we're all in our silos now.
Yeah.
And it's just an echo chamber. You only hear what you want to hear. And for the longest time, I had a texting relationship with a nice guy on the island that I knew because our kids were in school together, and he just got on the Trump train, and for a while we could have a discussion, but after a while we couldn't, because I would send him factual material and he said, I'm not going to read that, it's probably written by a Democrat. Mm-hmm. And then he just started then getting incredibly mean and hateful, and I had to give it up because, he wasn't the nice dad of the third grader that I'd known. He'd become this crazy guy. It is
difficult. I run into them here. They followed me to Washington, the Silicon Valley people, and I ran into one who was going on about how they'd won. See, they've got you, Kara, you were wrong, and burn book, etc. Went on and on to me, and I said, "Are you done?" And I go, "You may have." I said, "You may have won, but you're still an asshole." So. That's what I would say to him, just if you want. So last question, and then we're going to get some quick ones from the audience. What's next for you? You wrote at the end of the book, this story of a death is a story that dominates my life. Here I have retold it, rethought it, but I can't change it. Tony is dead, present tense. He will be dead in the present, in my present, for as long as I'm alive. I cannot change that story. I can only change myself. I would love to know what change looks like for you and what you're going to be doing next. And before you do that first, and then I have one last thing I want to ask.
Just working more. I realized that I've kind of filled the void in my life where we used to sit around, drink wine, and tell jokes at night by just working. So, I used to think I worked a lot, but now I'm really a machine.
So work is what you've done. But is there a goal for your life now?
Just to make it as vivid and worthwhile as I can for as long as I've got, and love my kids.
So the last part of the book, I'd like you to read it. I hope you don't mind. There's a scene where you go out swimming out in the ocean, and you start to wail for Tony. and you say, I wail for him, for the life he no longer has, for the life we no longer have together. I'd like you to read, and then we'll just, I have one short question when you finish that, from when I turn back to the end, if you can do that, because it'll make me cry.
Not sure.
You can't read it? Would you? I can read it, but you wrote it.
From where?
From here.
When I turn back towards the shack, no, I can't.
Okay. Okay, you can't see it. Okay. When I turn back towards the shack, there's nothing left. I am spent at last. All that remains is a long exhalation, a sustained sigh. When I started to write fiction, I came across a piece of advice on the craft of novel writing. Your task as a novelist is to keep pushing your protagonist's head under the water throughout the narrative. But when you get to the end, you must decide, will you sink them or let them swim? I put my face in the clear, briny water. I stretch out my body. I swim. Why did... I thought for a second, why didn't you sink it? But what is swimming then?
Swimming is being grateful. 35 years of happy marriage, not everybody gets that. In fact, hardly anybody gets it to the extent that we did, where we were so up in each other's business and, worked together, lived together, had 2 healthy children. I mean, so much to be grateful for. And grateful for his books, because we can always turn to those and find him there, which is wonderful. And and just trying to live with the enthusiasm that he had about living, and do that and kind of dedicate it to him.
So do you have to be more outgoing now?
Sorry?
Do you have to be more outgoing now?
I try.
You're much better at it. When I met you, actually, I'm recalling he was so bubbly, and then you were not. And you weren't glum or anything, but I remember telling someone, I'm like, that's interesting. But then I got it pretty quickly. So let's have some questions from the audience. Speaking of which, it's Leslie from Arlington. I've read almost all your books, but none of Tony's. Where should I start?
It depends. If you're interested in American history, his kind of most popular and classic is Confederates in the Attic. But then he wrote another book that I think hasn't been appreciated enough, and it's wonderful, and it's just a straight history book with none of the gonzo stuff in it, which is Midnight Rising, about John Brown and the raid that sparked the Civil War. And it is a fantastic narrative history. But if you just want to get a sense of Tony and the fun and serious side of him, I think we keep pulling Baghdad Without a Map off the shelf, which is about our time in the Middle East, where he was off having all these crazy adventures while I was stuck waiting for Yasser Arafat to come and lie to me.
Sounds like fun. What took you so long to howl? Do you wish you had done it sooner? This is Sally who asked this question.
I don't think I could have. I think now I needed to make all the mistakes that I made in order to realize what I needed and to act on it.
So this is another question. Were you ever able to talk to the attending physician who oversaw the resident who you initially spoke to on Tony's passing? What transpired was not standard care or humane. My husband and I, this is Sheila from Philadelphia, an MD and an RN were so sad for you and very sorry, the healthcare professionals, that you didn't have a better experience at this difficult time. Were you ever able to talk to them?
Well, since the book came out, I have had contact with the hospital, and they are looking at putting in new protocols. So that's good.
All right. That's great. Melanie from Annapolis, how do you see the role of the artist in these dangerous political times we're living through in the U.S. and globally? Do you still have hope for our children and future generations?
I
Big
hope.
question.
I hope I have.
Melanie from Annapolis, you're a bummer. Well, come on over. All right. Go for it.
I mean, I have to, because I've got 2 kids, and I would like them to have a planet and to, if they choose to raise kids of their own, and you've got even younger kids,
Yeah.
and I have to believe that we will come to our senses again. I mean, when you look at American history, so much went wrong before it went right. I mean, the abolitionists were working for years, and everything went against them. And then they got the Fugitive Slave Act, and the North was implicated in terrible crimes against humanity, sending people back to enslavement. It took... I hope it's not going to take another war. I got to believe that we've evolved beyond that. But I can't believe that this is our future. I mean, it was only 2008 when we elected Obama, and we thought, we're really moving in a progressive direction, and the backlash was so enormous. I hope that there'll be a backlash against this that is even more drastic and kicks us into...
What is the role of the artist as Melody?
The artist, I think, I think art really matters at times like this, and I think sometimes you can't reach people through reasoned arguments not working. So maybe it is the emotional pull of art that might bring some people back to, I think, sanity.
Any advice to reporters who are reporting right now? There has been a pullback. There has been people being nervous. Either it's corporate people. I've noticed it quite a bit. I've had a lot of people warn me to tone it down.
Yeah, no, I mean...
Yeah, I'm not going to.
Yeah, I don't think you are.
I always say, fuck them if they can't take a joke. But go ahead.
I think there's really good reporting happening, and I hope it will continue. I mean, I do believe it will. One of the upsides of the period we live in is that you don't need a press to have freedom of the press. There are plentiful ways of getting reporting out there, and I know that brave people will continue to do it, as they have had to do in many countries in this world where repressive governments threaten their liberty and their lives. And I've seen journalists,
Definitely.
go to jail for their reporting, and that might happen here. And, but I know there'll be people who will do that.
All right. So last question from Laura. Friends and family often struggle to support people experiencing intense grief. What was the most helpful to you from people, and maybe not helpful? And then what things did you stop doing or double down on following your husband's passing?
So helpful was people who came to me with stories about Tony, and particularly if it was a story I hadn't heard yet, that was particularly wonderful. Not helpful is if somebody has had a big loss and they've managed to drag themselves out of the house to go to a movie, say, do not come up to them crying about how badly you feel about the loss of their husband. If they're not crying, don't you be crying. That was hard for me, And what was the next bit?
What things did you stop doing or double down following your husband's passing?
What did I stop doing? I can't think of having sex.
You could double down. Too soon?
And what was?
No, it's not too soon. Just so you know, I'm working on fixing that. Go ahead.
What was it?
What stop doing or doing? Double down on.
Double down on. What did I double down on? I have learned to keep my receipts. I got nothing. I don't know. I mean, I doubled down on having to understand all the things that I hadn't had to bother with. So, it was funny because you go to work at the Wall Street Journal and you have like this steep learning curve, and you understand price earnings ratios and the inverted yield curve. momentarily. And then the minute you get kicked to the foreign desk, you don't have to bother with that anymore, and you forget all about it. But
I think you've gotten more outgoing, actually. You've been saying things, and I'm like, you were always very, and I go, Geraldine, naughty. Like, I kind of like it. You're a little more like Tony in an odd way, in an interesting way. So very last question. One more story about Tony that wasn't in the book that you think of, that you've learned.
one more story about Tony. Oh, God. That wasn't in the book. I think... I can't come up with one, so I'll just tell you one that is in the book and that I think tells you everything about who he was as a reporter. So he did not like the fact that the US military really wanted to contain reporters during the first Gulf War and had everybody stuck in this terrible hotel in Dhahran in Saudi Arabia. And so he decided he wasn't going to do that anymore. And he had noticed that Saudi soldiers, infantrymen, sent their uniforms, their fatigues, to the dry cleaners. Not many infantrymen would do that. And so he went to a dry cleaner and bribed the dry cleaner to give him a Saudi's uniform so that he could go to the front lines, and that's how he was able to pass himself off as one of the Kuwaiti troops that liberated the city.
Geraldine Brooks.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Geraldine Brooks and Kara Swisher. Thank you all for joining us. Please stay seated while our guests make their way backstage. You can exit using the main lobby and the lobby to your left.